They mocked the Black Maid for ruining the tablecloth, until the Mafia Boss protected her with one sentence. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character. Elena Brooks had learned how to move quietly in rooms that were never built for people like her. And tonight the private dining hall felt larger than usual, a long mahogany table stretching under crystal lights that reflected wealth from every polished surface. She adjusted the crisp white tablecloth with careful hands, smoothing a crease the way she always did, measured and precise, as if the fabric could feel her intention to do things right. The guests were already seated, voices layered with laughter and expensive confidence, the kind that floated easily because it had never been questioned. Elena kept her eyes lowered, counting steps in her head, 3 feet to the left, 1 step back, making sure the place settings aligned perfectly, silverware catching the light like small mirrors. Then it happened, a brief moment that would later feel much longer, when a glass tilted at the wrong angle and a dark splash of wine spread across the cloth like a bruise blooming on white skin. The room reacted before Elena could speak, a sharp intake of breath, a pause in conversation that carried weight, not concern but expectation. She reached for a napkin immediately, her voice calm as she apologized, already offering to replace the cloth, knowing the procedure by heart. But apologies, she understood, did not always stop what people wanted to say. A chuckle came first, then another, followed by a comment delivered just loud enough to be heard, the kind that pretended to be humor while aiming low. Elena felt the heat rise in her face but kept her posture straight, shoulders back the way her mother had taught her, because dignity was something you carried even when no one else acknowledged it. Around her, the guests leaned into the moment, glances exchanged, smirks shared, the story. Writing itself without her consent, the Black Maid who ruined the tablecloth, the easy target, the convenient explanation. No one asked how the glass had tipped or noticed the subtle tremor in the air that suggested someone else had brushed the table moments before. Elena focused on the texture of the fabric beneath her fingers, the steady rhythm of her breathing, reminding herself that this was just another room, another night, another test of patience. She did not see the man at the head of the table watching in silence, his untouched drink resting near his hand, his gaze sharp and unreadable, taking in not the stain on the cloth, but the way the room revealed itself in reaction to it. Elena prepared to step away, to fetch a replacement, to do what was expected without protest, unaware that the quiet judgment forming in that man's mind was already shifting the balance of the evening in a way no one else could yet imagine. Elena Brooks stood still for a half-second longer than she should have, long enough to feel the weight of the room settle onto her shoulders, before bending slightly to gather the stained edge of the tablecloth with careful fingers. The fabric was thick, imported, heavy with expectation, and as she lifted it, she heard the quiet snickers grow bolder, no longer whispered but shared openly like an inside joke she was never meant to understand. Someone remarked that the cloth probably cost more than her monthly paycheck. Another voice added that mistakes like that were why people like her should stay in the kitchen, and the laughter that followed was light and effortless, the kind that did not worry about consequences. Elena kept her eyes down, not because she agreed, but because she knew the rules of survival in rooms like this, where dignity had to be protected silently. She spoke again, calm and professional, explaining that a replacement would be brought immediately, that the service would not be interrupted, that everything would be handled within minutes. Her voice did not shake, but her hands did, just enough for her to curl her fingers into her palms when she turned away, grounding herself in the small discipline of control. As she moved toward the service station, she felt the glances follow her, some curious, some amused, some sharp with judgment, all of them heavy in a way she had known since her first day on the job. She had grown up learning how to read rooms before she learned how to read books, learning when silence was safety and when standing tall was resistance. Tonight, silence was the only option the room allowed her. The comments continued behind her, a running commentary about carelessness and standards, about how events like this were supposed to be flawless, about how one person could ruin the atmosphere with a single mistake, even though no one seemed to remember who had tipped the glass in the first place. Elena focused on the practical steps, measuring the distance to the linen cabinet, counting seconds, steadying her breathing the way she did when the world pressed too close. She reminded herself that this job paid the bills, that it helped keep her mother's lights on back home, that endurance was not weakness but strategy. When she returned with a fresh cloth folded neatly over her arm, the laughter faded into murmurs, replaced by a different kind of attention, the kind that waited to see whether she would falter again. She worked efficiently, removing the stained fabric, resetting the table with practiced precision, her movements smooth despite the tension in the air. Not once did she look up at the faces around her, though she could feel their eyes tracking every motion. What she did not notice was how the man at the head of the table had stopped engaging with anyone beside him, how his attention had narrowed, not on the table or the wine or the event, but on the way Elena carried herself through the ridicule without surrendering her composure. The room believed the moment was over, that the small humiliation had run its course, but something unspoken lingered, a quiet shift beneath the surface, as if the night itself had paused to remember exactly who had revealed their character and who had not. Elena Brooks stepped back from the table once the new cloth lay perfectly smooth, its corners aligned with a precision that came from years of practice rather than praise, and she waited for a signal that never came, no nod of approval, no acknowledgement that the disruption had been resolved, only the low return of conversation that flowed around her as if she were part of the furniture. She stood with her hands folded at her waist, posture straight, eyes lowered, absorbing the subtle shift in tone as the guests resumed their evening, though a few voices carried an edge now, sharper than before, as if disappointment needed somewhere to land. Someone remarked that attention to detail was everything in places like this. Another added that mistakes revealed character, and although no one spoke her name, Elena understood exactly who they meant. She reminded herself to breathe slowly, counting each inhale and exhale, letting the familiar rhythm keep her steady while her mind drifted briefly to quieter spaces, to mornings before work when she drank coffee from a chipped mug and watched sunlight touch the kitchen wall, moments where she belonged entirely to herself. The dining hall, by contrast, demanded invisibility, and she had mastered that skill well, fading into the background while remaining alert to every need, every raised hand, every empty glass. From the corner of her vision, she sensed movement at the head of the table, the man who had remained still through the entire exchange now shifting slightly in his chair, his presence subtle but undeniable, the way gravity was felt rather than seen. Victor Romano did not speak, did not gesture, did not look at Elena directly, yet his silence carried weight, a pause that contrasted sharply with the careless remarks still drifting across the table. Elena noticed how one guest hesitated mid-sentence, another cleared their throat, as if something unseen had entered the space between words, altering the balance of the room. She focused on her next task, collecting and used plates, maintaining the cadence of service, because routine was the one thing she could control. As she moved, she caught fragments of conversation about business deals, travel plans, investments measured in millions of dollars, numbers so large they felt abstract, distant from the careful budgeting that defined her own life. The contrast was familiar, almost expected, yet tonight it felt sharper, amplified by the way a single spill had exposed the fragile hierarchy everyone pretended was natural. Elena placed a plate onto her tray and felt her fingers brush against a faint stain of wine on the porcelain, a reminder of how quickly blame had found her, how easily people reached for assumptions that fit their comfort. She straightened again, smoothing her apron, and prepared to step away when a quiet stillness spread across the table, not commanded, but sensed, as if the air itself had tightened. Victor Romano finally lifted his gaze, not toward Elena but across the guests, his expression unreadable, calm in a way that did not invite interruption. Elena felt it then, the unmistakable sensation of being on the edge of something, the way a room felt just before a storm that did not need thunder to announce itself. She did not know what would happen next, only that the evening had shifted beyond her control, and that the silence now settling over the table carried a judgment far heavier than any laughter that had come before. Elena Brooks remained at the edge of the dining hall, her tray balanced carefully against her hip, as the silence stretched longer than etiquette allowed, the kind of pause that made people shift in their seats without understanding why. She could feel her heartbeat in her ears, steady but insistent, a reminder that she was still standing, still present, even as the room seemed to forget her again. Years of experience had taught her that moments like this were dangerous not because of what was said, but because of what people felt permitted to think when no one corrected them. She replayed the comments in her mind, not to dwell on them, but to place them where they belonged, outside herself, refusing to let them define her worth. Her mother's voice echoed faintly in her memory, calm and firm, telling her that respect began with how one carried oneself when no one else bothered to offer it. Elena straightened her shoulders almost imperceptibly, grounding her feet against the polished floor, reminding herself that she had done her job exactly as she was trained to do. The spill had been handled, the table restored, the service uninterrupted, yet the tension lingered like a question waiting for an answer. Around the table, conversation resumed in fragments, but the energy had changed, words landing softer, laughter sounding forced, as if the room sensed it had crossed an invisible line. Elena watched the guests out of the corner of her eye, noticing how a few avoided looking in her direction now, not out of kindness but discomfort, the awareness that something about their behavior no longer sat easily. She focused instead on the small details she could control, aligning glasses, checking place settings, listening for requests, maintaining the rhythm that allowed her to move through spaces without drawing attention. Still, she could not ignore the man at the head of the table, Victor Romano, whose presence seemed to anchor the room in an unspoken way. He had not intervened, not yet, but his stillness carried intention, the calm of someone accustomed to being heard without raising his voice. Elena had seen powerful men before, though rarely this close, and she understood instinctively that his silence was not indifference but assessment. She wondered briefly if he had noticed the way blame had settled on her so quickly, if he had recognized the pattern she knew too well, the ease with which people assigned fault downward. She dismissed the thought just as quickly, because hope was a dangerous thing in environments like this, and she had learned not to expect rescue. Instead, she prepared herself for what usually came next, a quiet dismissal, a note in her file, a reminder to be more careful, even when care had never been the issue. As she reached for another plate, her fingers brushed the edge of the table, and she paused, feeling the smooth fabric beneath her hand, the restored surface hiding the moment that had exposed so much. She took a slow breath, steadying herself, ready to continue the evening as if nothing had happened, because endurance was often mistaken for acceptance, and she had survived long enough to know the difference. The room, however, seemed to hold its breath with her, suspended in a fragile balance, waiting for the judgment that had yet to be spoken, a judgment that would reveal far more about the people seated there than about the woman standing quietly among them. Victor Romano had spent most of the evening listening without listening, the conversations around him blending into a familiar background of polished voices and predictable ambitions, but the moment the room turned on Elena Brooks, his attention sharpened with quiet precision. He had seen scenes like this play out countless times in different forms, in boardrooms, restaurants, private clubs, always following the same unspoken rule that power protected itself by pointing downward. He noticed the way blame traveled instantly, skipping over convenience to land on the person least likely to challenge it, and he watched Elena absorb it without spectacle, without apology beyond what professionalism required. Her restraint stood out more than the stain ever had. Victor did not interrupt because interruption too early often disguised the truth, and he preferred to let people reveal themselves fully before deciding what mattered. From his seat at the head of the table, he observed how easily humor turned cruel when it faced no resistance, how laughter grew louder when it believed it was safe. He watched Elena replace the tablecloth with steady hands, her movements efficient, disciplined, carrying a quiet pride that did not beg for approval. It reminded him of people he respected, individuals who understood that dignity was not granted by rooms like this, but carried into them regardless. As the evening resumed, Victor sensed the subtle shift in energy that followed her return, the way voices softened just enough to mask discomfort, The way eyes avoided hers not out of remorse but awareness. He had not spoken yet because silence, when chosen, was a powerful lens, and through it he saw exactly who everyone was when they thought no one important was watching. The irony did not escape him. For years, people had mistaken his quiet for indifference, unaware that stillness was how he listened best. He noticed how one guest leaned back with satisfaction, how another smirked as if the moment had confirmed something they already believed, and how none of them considered that their behavior was being measured against a standard they did not control. Victor felt no anger, only clarity, the kind that arrived when patterns repeated themselves too perfectly to ignore. Elena stood at the edge of the room now, invisible again by design, and Victor recognized the discipline it took to remain composed under that weight. He did not know her story, but he knew enough to understand that strength often came wrapped in quiet endurance rather than noise. As conversation dragged on, he placed his hand near his glass but did not lift it, feeling the smooth surface of the table beneath his fingertips, the same table everyone else had treated as sacred moments earlier. He considered how easily people protected objects while discarding respect for individuals, and the thought settled heavily. The room continued, unaware that its unspoken verdict was forming, not against the woman they had mocked, but against themselves. Victor lifted his gaze slowly, not to command attention, but to claim it naturally, the way gravity did, and one by one the conversations tapered, sensing the shift. Even before understanding it, Elena did not look up, but Victor saw her pause, felt the room brace itself, and in that suspended moment, he decided that silence had served its purpose and that what came next would not need volume to be heard. The tension that had settled over the table did not dissolve, it sharpened, and one of the guests, emboldened by the silence, chose to fill it with a careless confidence that mistook restraint for permission. A man 2 seats down laughed softly and commented that accidents like this were why staff needed constant supervision, his tone polished, almost amused, as if he were offering wisdom rather than judgment. Another guest nodded, adding that standards slipped when people forgot their place, and the words landed heavier than intended, spreading through the table like a stain no cloth could hide. Elena Brooks heard every syllable even though she kept her gaze fixed on the tray in her hands, her body still, her expression neutral, the mask of professionalism held firmly in place. She had learned long ago that reacting only fed the spectacle, and yet the accumulation of small cuts pressed against her composure, testing the quiet strength she relied on to get through nights like this. She reminded herself that she had followed every protocol, that the table now looked flawless, that the criticism had nothing to do with service and everything to do with comfort, the comfort of speaking down without consequence. As another remark followed, lighter in tone but sharper in intent, Elena felt the familiar urge to step back, to make herself smaller, to retreat into invisibility before the moment grew worse. She adjusted her grip on the tray instead, grounding herself in the cool weight of porcelain, choosing presence over disappearance. Around the table, a few guests chuckled politely, others smiled without meeting her eyes, and the room leaned subtly toward the direction of cruelty, testing how far it could go without correction. Victor Romano listened, his expression unchanged, noting how quickly dignity eroded when people believed it cost them nothing. He watched Elena remain composed under the scrutiny, watched the guests grow bolder with each unchallenged word, and he understood that this was the moment when silence either endorsed what was happening or prepared the ground for something else entirely. The final comment came almost casually, a dismissive remark about how easily. The evening had been disrupted by someone who should have known better, and it carried an edge that stripped away pretense, revealing the belief beneath it. The table went quiet afterward, not because the speakers felt regret, but because the line had been crossed and everyone sensed it at once. Elena felt the heat rise again, not in her face this time, but in her chest, a tightness that came from holding herself together when the room expected her to accept the narrative being handed to her. She straightened slightly, ready to excuse herself if asked, prepared for the familiar outcome where the burden of restoring harmony fell on her alone. What she did not anticipate was the way the air shifted, the way Victor Romano placed his glass down with deliberate calm, the soft sound carrying farther than any raised voice. Conversation stopped mid-breath, eyes turned instinctively toward him, and Elena felt the weight of the moment settle, heavy and unmistakable, as if the room itself recognized that the balance had changed, and that whatever came next would define the evening far more clearly than a spill ever could. Victor Romano did not raise his voice or change his posture when he finally spoke, and that alone unsettled the room more than anger ever could, because authority that did not need to announce itself carried its own gravity. He let the silence stretch just long enough for everyone to understand it was intentional, then rested his hand flat on the table, fingers relaxed, eyes steady as they moved across the faces seated before him. The guests shifted, some straightening, others suddenly interested in their glasses, as if realizing too late that their words had been heard by the one person whose attention truly mattered. Elena Brooks stood frozen at the edge of the room, her tray still balanced, her breath held without realizing it, instinct telling her that something irreversible was unfolding. Victor's gaze did not land on her at first, and that omission spoke volumes, because it redirected the focus where it belonged. He looked instead at the guests who had spoken so freely moments earlier, his expression calm, unreadable, as though he were observing a simple fact rather than preparing a response. When he spoke, it was only one sentence, delivered evenly, without insult or emphasis, yet every word landed with precision. He said that if the table had been ruined, it was not by a spill, but by the way people chose to speak when they believed respect was optional. The sentence was not loud, not dramatic, but it cut through the room with clarity, stripping away excuses and leaving nothing to hide behind. The effect was immediate and complete. Conversation died where it sat, smiles faded, and the laughter that had come so easily before disappeared as if it had never existed. No one challenged him, no one defended themselves, because there was nothing to argue with, no raised voice to push against, no emotion to dismiss. Elena felt the words register slowly, like warmth spreading after cold, not because they were directed at her, but because they shifted the narrative that had been weighing on her since the moment the glass tipped. For the first time that evening, she felt seen without being singled out, protected without being pitted. Victor did not look at her even then, and that restraint mattered, because it preserved her dignity rather than placing her at the center of attention. He allowed the room to absorb the sentence on its own, trusting silence to do the rest. Guests lowered their eyes, some clearing their throats, others sitting very still, confronted not by accusation, but by reflection. The tablecloth lay smooth and untouched, suddenly insignificant compared to the discomfort settling over the table. Elena exhaled quietly, her shoulders easing by a fraction, the tension she had been holding loosening as the weight shifted away from her. Victor Romano reached for his glass at last, lifting it with the same calm he had maintained all evening, signaling without another word that the moment had passed and that the judgment had been delivered. The room did not return to its previous rhythm. It could not. Something fundamental had changed, not through force or spectacle, but through a single sentence that reminded everyone present exactly what respect looked like when it was enforced without cruelty. The silence that followed Victor Romano's sentence was not empty but heavy, settling over the table like a final verdict that required no further explanation. No one spoke. Forks rested untouched. Glasses remained where they were, and the confident ease that had filled the room earlier was replaced by a careful stillness, as if every guest were suddenly aware of their own posture, their own words, their own place. Elena Brooks stood exactly where she was, her body still trained for service, yet something inside her had shifted, subtle but undeniable. The weight that had pressed against her chest since the spill eased, not because the moment was dramatic, but because the blame that had clung to her had quietly fallen away. She did not lift her head immediately. Years of habit held her steady, cautious, waiting for instruction that might never come. Around the table, a few guests cleared their throats, others adjusted their seats, but no one resumed the conversation that had once flowed so easily. The atmosphere had changed its rules. A manager moved discreetly to Victor's side, asking in a low voice if anything else was needed, and Victor answered with a brief shake of his head, his attention already elsewhere, his message complete. He did not repeat himself. He did not look around for agreement. He trusted the room to understand. Elena felt eyes flick toward her and then away again, different now, stripped of amusement, carrying something closer to self-awareness. She took a careful step forward to collect an empty plate, her movements smooth, professional, unchanged. Yet the act itself felt different, no longer an exercise in invisibility, but a continuation of dignity she had never lost. The tablecloth remained pristine, its earlier stain now irrelevant, a reminder of how quickly objects could distract from behavior. Service continued, quieter, more restrained, as if everyone were aware that the evening had crossed an invisible threshold. Victor lifted his glass and took a measured sip, his calm signaling closure, not indulgence, and the guests followed suit. Conversation restarting in cautious fragments, stripped of edge and performance. Elena moved among them, efficient and composed, aware that no apology would be offered and none was required. What mattered had already been acknowledged. She felt the tension drain from her shoulders as the minutes passed, replaced by a steady clarity that surprised her. She had not been defended with anger or spectacle, but with precision, and that difference mattered. As the course concluded, Victor rose from his seat, the simple act drawing attention without demand. He nodded once to the manager, then turned slightly, his gaze finally meeting Elena's, not lingering, not dramatic, just long enough to communicate recognition without ownership. He spoke quietly, telling her the service had been handled well and that she could take a moment before the next course. The words were simple, but Elena felt them land deeply, because they were spoken without condescension, without exception, as a fact. She inclined her head in acknowledgement, not out of submission, but respect, and stepped back with a steadiness she carried into the rest of the night. The room never fully recovered its earlier arrogance. It did not need to. Something more important had taken its place, an unspoken understanding that dignity, once defended, had a way of changing everything without ever raising its voice. The evening wound down without ceremony, courses clearing away one by one, the dining hall returning to a measured calm that felt different from the polished confidence that had filled it earlier. Elena Brooks moved through the room with the same quiet efficiency she always had, yet her steps felt lighter, as if something heavy had been set down without anyone needing to announce it. She collected linens, aligned chairs, and checked settings, each small task anchoring her in the present, reminding her that work done well did not need defense. The guests spoke more carefully now, their voices subdued, their laughter restrained, the edge gone as if it had never belonged. No one addressed the spill again. No one offered an apology. None was required. The absence of mockery said enough. Victor Romano remained composed, speaking little, his presence steady and unintrusive, allowing the room to correct itself. When the final course concluded and chairs began to slide back, Elena noticed how eyes met hers differently, brief and respectful, then moved on. She did not seek acknowledgement. She did not need it. As the room emptied, the manager approached her with a nod of approval, thanking her for maintaining professionalism under pressure, words that felt ordinary yet sincere. Elena accepted them with a small smile, knowing that professionalism was often praised only after it had been tested. Victor passed by on his way out, stopping just long enough to say quietly that she had done nothing wrong. The sentence delivered without flourish, without expectation, a simple statement of fact. Elena met his gaze and inclined her head, not in gratitude alone, but in recognition of restraint, of justice delivered without spectacle. When the doors closed and the lights softened, the room exhaled. Elena gathered the last folded cloth and placed it neatly where it belonged, smoothing the fabric one final time. The stain that had started it all was gone, erased completely, yet the lesson it had revealed remained, not etched into the table, but into memory. She thought of the morning ahead, of coffee in her chipped mug, of sunlight on the wall, of a quiet pride that could not be taken by careless words. As she removed her apron and prepared to leave, she felt steady, centered, unchanged in who she was but affirmed in something deeper. The world had not suddenly become fair, but for one evening, dignity had been defended with clarity, and that mattered. Outside, the night air was cool and still, and Elena paused for a moment before stepping forward, carrying herself the way she always had, shoulders back, head level, moving on without bitterness. Somewhere behind her, A room remembered what respect looked like when it was enforced without cruelty, and the silence that followed carried the weight of truth. And that night, without raised voices or grand gestures, the balance was restored, leaving behind a quiet understanding that dignity, once protected, does not ask to be seen, it simply stands.